When talking about fulfilling its functions, we can see that the smaller and more localised a government is, the more efficient it is. We can also see that smaller governments are more representative as well. The village to the east of our original village has a government that is much more active in its inhabitants' lives. It has been this way for generations, and the population is happy for the government to dictate whose turn it is to fetch the water and how people can build their houses. There is also a tax on the household's daily hunt so that the entire population can be fed at the community feast each night. This is a tradition that is shared by 15 of the region's villages. The village to the west does not share this tradition, and its inhabitants are free to keep their food to themselves. On the whole, the inhabitants of both villages are satisfied with the status quo. If someone from the eastern village feels that their tradition is beneficial because it helps build community, he can travel to the western village and attempt to convince the population of its merits. If his campaign is successful, he will persuade the western village to adopt the tradition, and they can enforce it by law. There is nothing wrong with this, because if the laws are changed, it will only be because the population was in favour of it. But what happens if the individual from the eastern village is unsuccessful? He refuses to give up, utterly convinced of the superiority of his village's position on the issue, even if the western village cannot see it. He then convinces the 15 villagers who share the tradition to vote for the central regional government to assume authority over laws regarding food distribution. While this is a very simplified example, the principle is sound. The smaller government is, the more likely they are to legislate according to the region's unique needs, and the easier it is for the region's inhabitants to influence the policies that affect them. When governments get bigger and more centralised, diversity becomes harder to take into account when legislating, and for those in the minority position, influencing policy becomes almost impossible. The brutal truth about democracy is that the majority rules, and the laws can never represent the views of each individual. This is why the best interest of individuals is to keep governments as small and localised as possible, so that the majority is a small enough number that policy can be easily changed to suit the electorate, and so people can choose the government or village that best suits their views. The smaller government is, the more likely your taxes will go towards something that you will use. History is littered with countless examples of those who abuse their position in power, succumb to corruption, and betray the interests of those they supposedly represent. The reason for this is because positions in government allow individuals to make decisions for other individuals, and this confers to them significantly more power than the average citizen. The universal truth is, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. With this in mind, the logical size of government would be as small as is practically possible. There are some areas of government that are not practical to be dealt with by small local governments, like the running of a national defence force. One would then expect that the highest levels of government would be subject to the most intense scrutiny. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Big governments have very low levels of accountability. The average person on the street barely trusts his local government councillors not to skim a few dollars here and there. And yet, at this level of government, meetings minutes are available to the public, and budgets can be scrutinised by everyday citizens. Let's return to our village's example. Let's assume that there is a scandal going on in a village to the north about a conflict of interest from one of the government's representatives. Being in such a small village, all of the citizens know each other personally, and so when this representative hired the Northern Builders Company to renovate the community centre, it was quickly found out that he had a close friendship with the man who owned the company. The plans were thrown out because people took notice of the $50,000 cost, almost 20% of that year's budget. There's a similar scandal going on in the central regional government, and yet this one goes unnoticed. The minister in charge of the armed forces tells Parliament that, because of growing threats from neighbouring nations, they must purchase new state-of-the-art body armour for their troops. This threat cannot be confirmed because the minister's meetings are classified for reasons of national security. The total cost of this new equipment is over $100,000, only 1% of that year's budget. Nobody takes notice, and the close ties the minister has to the weapons manufacturer goes unscrutinised. Ultimately, even if we refuse to believe that our big government leaders could be corrupt, we must recognise that corruption in their position means a lot worse consequences than can ever occur in small government. One of the saddest recurring stories of the last century has been the countless failed revolutions. People of a nation overthrowing a repressive dictator from his position at the head of a big government and replacing him with a man who vows to end the corruption and tyranny, only to suffer the same injustice from this new individual. The fatal flaw is assuming that there is something wrong with the man and not the system. But the key is not trying to place this enormous authority with the right person, but to strip all individuals of such power. Whatever authority is needed to govern the people, the most logical way to distribute authority is over as many people or bodies as possible, not to centralize it in the hands of the few. This is particularly important regarding big business and large corporations. Many people argue that we need big government to protect us against these companies and fail to realize that it is through the existence of big government that big business has become so powerful. They are in partnership. Corporations spend millions each year lobbying individuals in big government successfully for subsidies, tariffs against cheap imports, and regulations preventing competition from threatening their monopoly status. If power was not so centralized, corporations would struggle to receive the benefits they currently receive from big government. To truly bring down the monopolies of big corporations, free competition must be allowed to prosper, and this means putting the consumer, not big government, in charge. After so many years of war, many people are still asking, when will it stop? After World War I, people assumed that war would become a thing of the past, and yet almost 100 years later, it seems as if wars are as common as ever. But why? Only a minute percentage of the population is ever in favour of war, and the overwhelming majority would prefer to live in peace and harmony. In our quest for world peace, are we making the same mistakes again? Incredibly, people are happily supporting moves towards bigger and bigger government, under the assumption that this will prevent wars. The goal is to unite the world under organisations like the European Union and the United Nations, so there is less opportunity for people to go to wars over disagreements. But people do not start wars. Governments do. Before the Gulf War or the Vietnam War, people weren't sitting around discussing whether they should try and convince their government of the danger Ho Chi Minh posed. They knew nothing about the Viet Cong's military, what weapons it possessed, or how North Vietnam threatened their lives personally. I'm not suggesting that the war did not have any support from the people, but we must recognise that it was governments who disagreed with each other and then convinced the population to support a war. We all want peace. If we are to achieve this in our lifetime, there are two options. The first is the current path that we are treading. That is, transferring authority over as many people as possible to one body so that there is no existing opposition. The second is to strip all governments of their authority over us that gives them the power to make war. The likelihood is that both options will be successful in bringing an end to wars. But if we want personal freedom, a representative and accountable government, and equality among all individuals, we must say no to big government.